Intelligent cybersecurity. Well, while the world is focused on the health and economic threats posed by the COVID-19, the cyber criminals around the world undoubtedly are capitalizing on this crisis. Well, this now section will be covering on looking at adopting intelligent tools like the AI and machine learning to help detect cybersecurity threats promptly to these attacks. So first up, to touch upon the topic of offensive AI versus defensive AI, battle of algorithms, we've got a tech talk coming up. And it's going to be by none other than Andrew, who's joining us on for that. So thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. Well, Andrew is the Director of Technology, Darktrace. Andrew is a technical expert on cybersecurity and advises Darktrace strategic customers on advanced threat defense, AI, and autonomous response. He has a background in threat analysis and research and holds a first-class degree in physics from the Oxford University and a first-class degree in philosophy from the King's College London. His comments on cybersecurity and threat to critical national infrastructure have been reported in international media, including CNBC and BBC World. So thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. If I may request you to please unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, I can perfectly hear you.
Excellent, great.
Thank you.
So I guess I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me just do that. All right, so thank you for the introduction. I am going to be speaking for the next 20 minutes or so about offensive AI and the ways in which threat actors are beginning to use machine learning and AI to automate and improve a lot of their attack capabilities. So before I get into it, just a little background on who I am, who we are, Darktrace. So we are a, oh, sorry, something's, oh, there we go. Yeah. So we are a UK company founded about 7 years ago. We use machine learning and AI for cyber defense. And that means thinking about how we can improve both the efficiency and the capability of detection, response and investigation of cyber threats for our customers. We do this around the world now. We have over 3,000 customers, one of the fastest growing tech companies in the world, seventh fastest growing tech company in Europe. So we've been very lucky to have a lot of success over the last few years, and that's all been driven by our championing of the importance of using machine learning and AI to detect and stop threats, especially to respond to them autonomously. So to have something in place that allows you to step in and immediately contain and deal with threats that come into the environment. So I want to talk to you about the bad guys and some of the ways in which we should be very concerned about threat actors leveraging machine learning and AI over the next few years to achieve some of the same gains that we've seen happen on the defensive side over the last few years, because we've learned that the ability to automatically process data, model and make decisions autonomously is very powerful. And there's lots of good reasons to expect the attackers to make use of that as well. So just to set the scene of where we are today, there's obviously many different trends and themes that you can talk about in cybersecurity and the threat landscape. I just wanted to talk about three of them. The first is the current adoption of 5G and the boom of IoT devices that comes with that. Gartner reckons that we're going to move from 14 billion to 25 billion internet connected devices by 2022. And by all accounts, that's very, very plausible. The explosion in 5G infrastructure is creating a massive increase in the number of devices and the degree of connectivity between them, especially in industrial applications. And so there's a complexity problem here. there's a shift from the ability to manage and protect a networked environment of maybe a few hundred or few thousand devices to when you shift to millions of devices, the scale increases so much that it becomes very difficult for humans to monitor and protect these environments. And it becomes very attractive for attackers to think about how they can automate and scale their attack to millions of endpoints. So 5G and IoT moves us from a sort of manual world to an automated world in both attacking and defending over the next few years. The other trend is the complexity of cloud environments. So most of the people we work with now have many SaaS applications. They have many different departments with their own accounts inside public cloud infrastructure. And we've seen a real shift over the last year of attackers really focusing on compromising and hijacking user accounts in cloud environments like Microsoft 365. These attacks are behavioral. You don't normally have an indicator. They start through either social engineering attack, or they've already stolen your credential elsewhere, and now they're replaying that against the login page of the login infrastructure of the environment. So catching them is very tricky. And I'll give you an example later about how we're very worried about AI improving the ability to socially engineer people and steal their passwords to gain access to these third-party services. And finally, the threat to critical infrastructure. There's a lot of energy on both the defensive and the offensive side at the minute around how do we protect and how do we attack the sorts of legacy environments that you get in manufacturing, oil and gas, power, utilities, defense, these sorts of sectors. And a lot of the most worrying trends at the minute focus attackers on how they can operate inside those highly secured environments without being detected. And that has very strong relevance for what I'm about to talk about with offensive AI. So to talk to you about offensive AI, what we mean by that obviously are threat actors using machine learning and AI to improve the way they carry out their attacks. And today their attacks are beginning to show the first signs of early automation and decision making in a very early sense inside the tools and the malware that are being used. But if we think about why attackers would want to continue down this path and begin to use AI more thoroughly, we need to think about what AI does. So the first thing is that it improves the speed and scale at which you can operate. And attackers are very much motivated by return on investment. And what that means is that today, if you're an attacker and you want to go after a specific company and target them, and you want to do it well, involving all the manual steps of reconnaissance, understanding the target, profiling employees, coming up with plausible ways to scam them or socially engineer them, gain initial access, figure out what tools and systems they use internally so you can design what payloads and vulnerabilities you'll exploit. To do all of that long work in the kill chain, as we refer to it in these attacks, that means that the target has to be worth attacking, because carrying that attack off and successfully executing that requires a large amount of man hours and investment to do it. And so what that means is that today, those sorts of sophisticated attacks only really happen against high-value targets. And small and medium-sized enterprises, they experience a much lower sophistication of attack that can be sent en masse to everybody. So sort of very obvious phishing emails, and I'll talk about them in just a second, where it's quite easy to tell that this isn't legitimate. It's not being designed for you. It's not being crafted for you. It's just being sent to everybody. Those are much easier to stop, but they can be sent en masse. The worry here is that once threat actors have malicious or offensive AI, they will be able to automate that sophistication and the tailoring of the attack to the specific target, and they'll be able to replicate it at scale for all targets. And so the worry here is that you can do what we can only do today with basic phishing emails, where we target hundreds and thousands of companies, but they can do it with the level of sophistication that today you can only do against one or two targets because it takes so much time to do that. And the other big aspect is how much harder it is to detect AI-based systems inside environments. All attackers have to try to avoid detection, that largely means blending in to the network that you find yourself in, trying to avoid doing anything that would trip an alarm and give your presence away. And today that's a very human process, and it's very error prone. You have to try and guess, if I did this thing, would it blend in, or would someone spot that from the security team? And there's various ways in which AI can automatically learn and automate that process. So to talk more specifically, to make this a bit clearer about that initial compromise piece, the phishing email piece. Here's a pretty standard looking phishing email that isn't too hard to tell that this isn't legitimate. It's just junk mail being sent at you. But 94% of threats today still originate from emails sent in. And these emails get through already as it is today. Basic blacklisting and email gateway techniques are somewhat effective when there's malware payloads attached that they can scan, or when it comes from a known sender. But we've seen, for example, during the last 2 months, very successful campaigns carried out using the coronavirus as a lure to trick people into responding to timely emails. So these attacks are continuously successful. But let's think how much harder they could be to stop if you were dealing with something like an AI system being used to craft those emails. So this is far more believable. This looks like exactly the sort of thing that the target would fall victim to. And if I wanted to do this, what I'd do is I would go online and I would go on LinkedIn and I would research Jonathan Smith, and I would understand something about their role in the company, where they've been, the conference they went to in Orlando last week. I could very, very plausibly attach an email, a Word document like this to an email, go under the cover of pretending to be someone that talked to them at the conference last week, or pretend to be an internal employee, which is all too easy still to spoof internal employees. With enough plausible context, this would get past people's suspiciousness radar. And this is the sort of thing that you can do now with machine learning. There's a free website called talktotransformer.com that you can go to, and you can put in a sentence about somebody, like Andrew TSONCHEV works at Darktrace, and it will generate text for you, like a paragraph of very legible, correct sounding text that you could use automatically in an email about that person. So once these sorts of emails are the standard that we're up against with dealing with malicious emails, the idea that most security tools out there will be able to spot these is not very plausible. It's very unlikely that employees would do a good job at sifting through these. That's going to be very difficult to deal with. And the same idea is true at every step in that kill chain. This is an idea of how you can automate all that manual work of reconnaissance and information gathering and writing of emails and get an AI system to do it for you. But the same is true of scanning inside the environment, lateral movement, figuring out how to establish command and control so you won't be detected, figuring out how to exfiltrate data without being detected, figuring out what's a good target to exfiltrate. At every step of the way, you can use decision-making informed by the data that your malware, your AI-powered malware, can gather inside the environment for it to automate those steps. And so I'll give you some examples of the various steps now. I'll come back to them in just a second to give you some examples of the various steps with real attacks we've seen today and how we could think about AI making those more sophisticated. But before I do that, I just wanted to talk about the flip side to this, which is how you defend against these sorts of levels of sophistication. What do you do? Well, we like to call this an immune system approach. And the idea is that there's many ways to use machine learning and AI in cybersecurity. The most common way is to train machine learning systems to recognize previously seen attacks. So to gather hundreds of thousands of malware samples, train a system to be able to recognize it, to say, that's what the TrickBot banking Trojan looks like, that's what XBash looks like, whatever it is. And then you have a pre-trained system using machine learning that can detect threats based on whether or not they look similar to threats that have been seen before. That's very good. It's a lot better than old school rules and signatures. But it's not the sort of approach that will help you with highly novel attacks and highly tailored attacks like the ones we've been discussing. So the alternative approach is instead not to pre-train a system to look for anything in the past, but to give it the ability to learn on the job. And so we call this an immune system approach because the human immune system does this. It learns continuously what the normal human body environment looks like, and it detects the idea that there's a pathogen, a virus inside the body based on how it stands out and looks different and not self. And so what we've spent the last 7 years doing at Darktrace is building a digital version of immune system for businesses that sits inside the perimeter, it sits inside the organization. And much like the skin does a good job of keeping out lots of threats to the body, but your immune system is a thing that recognizes the stuff that gets to and fights back against it. We've been using machine learning and AI to recognize and fight back against stuff that comes into the environment. And so you do it by training models to understand what every user and device behaves like. And then when they see a sign that that user or that device is being compromised and is behaving differently, then we take action. And this is the autonomous response piece. The idea is that you need to be able to operate at speed and at scale to autonomously respond to threats, because thinking back to what I was saying about 5G and the cloud and the complexity and scale of our customers' environments these days, and the increased speed of ransomware and attacks and destructive malware, and the possibility of attackers very quickly soon being able to blend in far more easily, you need something that can respond within seconds to these threats that you wouldn't be able to find and respond quickly enough to with humans. So the way this works is if, say, I suddenly start behaving very strangely, my laptop starts doing strange things, or my Microsoft 365 account starts behaving strangely, what our technology will do is it will identify that strange behavior, and then it will use its understanding of the normal good behavior to drag me back to correct functioning, if you like, to enforce good behavior back on me. We call it enforcing patterns of life. What that means is that all the bad stuff that's going on, like the command and control from the malware on my laptop, or if I'm behaving maliciously, my attempts to exfiltrate data out externally, those will be stopped, but we can keep all the essential business services intact. So as long as I don't stray too far outside what me and my colleagues and my peers have been learned by Darktrace do as part of our daily work, then the system will let me do that. And this means that you can take surgical actions, and it means that you can automatically respond to threats without worrying about the impact that you'll cause to the business, because you don't want to just block things all over the place and kill crucial services. But when done correctly, most of the time people don't even know this is happening to them. So we'll protect employees in the background when their devices get compromised, and it won't stop them doing their job, because we'll let them do all the stuff that they normally do throughout that. So I hope that gives you an idea of how we, especially, and others, are using machine learning and AI to automate that detection and that response to deal with these kinds of very novel and sophisticated threats. In the last few minutes here, I just wanted to give you a few examples to make this a little bit clearer. So let's think about lateral movement. What happens when attackers get inside an environment and they have to start figuring out how to move inside the company? They will do network scanning. They will identify potential high-value targets like domain controllers. They will move laterally. They are figuring out on the go what the next step should be. This is when you have a proper hands-on keyboard manual attack. Now, here's a recent attack from one of our customers. It's a law company. They got hit with TrickBot, which is a banking Trojan malware. TrickBot's an info stealing tool. But it can also propagate autonomously itself. It can spread laterally the way ransomware does. So normally it lands and it spreads, but in this case, we found that a couple of the devices that were compromised also had the Empire PowerShell post-exploitation framework on them. And that's a tool set that's used by manual attackers with hands-on keyboards for them to do more sophisticated type lateral movement inside the environment. And so this is a hybrid attack. This is a hybrid of automated and human-driven. And the attackers were giving themselves the flexibility to figure out opportunistically what to do next once they were inside the environment. That's exactly what attackers will seek to automate very soon with machine learning, because when today you need hands-on keyboard manually running something like the Empire framework to figure out how to move laterally inside the environment. But if the malware can figure that out for itself, then you can make those sorts of decisions and take advantage of what you find in the target in a way that today you need individual people actively running those campaigns with hands-on keyboard to do it. Here's another example. Blending in. So command and control is still the biggest giveaway of all infections in all environments, because attackers need to keep a tether and a link to the systems they've compromised. So all attackers want to blend in. This is a an attack recently in a power mortar company where they used a self-signed SSL certificate that they injected to pretend to be Microsoft so that they could get approved as legitimate Windows updates, so that this malware was able to then call back to the attacker infrastructure and get accepted, and the fake certificate was approved by the operating system and allowed to make the connection. So that's a pretty good attempt at blending in and passing off your command and control as something legitimate, in this case, a Windows connection to Microsoft infrastructure. But this is exactly the sort of thing that machine learning will get way better at. If machine learning can understand what software is running in an environment by looking passively at what else is going on, and it can make decisions about what particular path to pick for the least likelihood of detection, then it'll be far harder to spot these. And the final example I'll give you here is on the last part of that kill chain, which is data exfiltration. So we recently had a customer of ours where we detected lots and lots and lots of connections sending small 1 megabyte chunks out over a 24-hour period, exfiltrating about 15 gigabytes worth of data. Now, this is a classic low and slow type attempt, but this is being manually done. Someone was trying to send it out slowly in a way that they thought, at times they thought, wouldn't attract attention. If you can do that automatically, if you can have a malware system that sits on a device that's compromised and says, it's normal for these users to send files externally to this file sharing site. No one ever sends files more than maybe 20 megabytes. So the way I should try and exfiltrate this is in 20 megabyte chunks from this person's laptop, because they're the sort of person that would get away with that. If you can do that sort of automation, then it'll be incredibly hard to spot these sorts of attacks. So thank you for the time. I hope that was interesting. I hope that gives you an idea of some of the sorts of things that attackers are trying to do and why machine learning and AI will make things much harder for them in the future. And I hope it also gives you a sense why it's valuable and increasingly important and almost essential now to think about leveraging machine learning and AI on the defensive side to have a chance of combating these sorts of threats at scale in real time.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew, for that great presentation out there. And a big, big thank you for joining us today.